Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Christensen. I'm a professor at Brigham Young University in the Romney Institute of Public Service and Ethics, and wanted to share just a short little presentation with you entitled Why Bureaucrat Isn't a Bad Word, but why most are confused about this. So one of the things that we see quite frequently, at least in popular media, is a vision of government that is wasteful, bound by red tape, and inefficient and slow. And I think this is a prevailing um, view of government for a variety of reasons. But the one that I want to focus on today is a way to think about this in terms of the measuring stick that we're using to measure government. And so I want to step back and just think about a few examples um, of different ways that we measure things and how we measure matters. So, for example, there's some obvious inconsistencies in the following examples. We would never use a basketball scoreboard to measure a softball game. In fact, if we were to compare high scores of a softball game and high scores of a basketball game, we'd have pretty immediate evidence that these two sports require different measuring sticks. Similarly, we would never measure gasoline using a food scale or by weight. Obviously, we use volume to measure gasoline. When we think about how this applies to government, one of the things that we're often competing with is a prevailing notion that a business measuring stick is perhaps the right measuring stick. And so you see popular books like Osborne and Plastrick's book, Banishing Bureaucracy, The Five Strategies for Reinventing Government. And a lot of these varieties of arguments are based on the fact that we have this, I think, intuitive sense that government should be measured with the yardstick of efficiency. Um, Perhaps it's because of prevailing sort of market logics that are fairly easy to access and understand. But one of the ideas here is that we often pick up one scoreboard, for example, the scoreboard from business, and we overlay it on other institutions like government and nonprofits. And my argument here is that that is just as inappropriate as it would be to measure gasoline using a food scale. It's the wrong method, it's the wrong tool. And to think about this perhaps a little differently, to move away from the yardstick and into an organizational chart, one of the things as we're thinking about business from an organizational perspective, we see, I think, a view that lends itself to this idea that managers within business organizations, for-profit business organizations, have unified or a more unified set of bosses. And so what shareholders want and what the CEO wants are largely aligned. What consumers want largely lines up with this. And this goes back a little bit earlier to a point I raised about market logics, that the market is a good governor or indicator of sort of supply and demand for these kinds of private for-profit goods, where price can be readily seen, measured, understood. For example, with dollars and cents as a measuring stick. But using that kind of measuring stick for government, again, just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit. And I'll get into the organizational chart for government in just a little bit. But one of the primary questions that we should be asking is, well, why? So if you were to take the argument of this PowerPoint presentation back and discuss it with your friends, they would say, well, why? Why wouldn't we use dollars and cents and efficiency and business models as the yardstick for government or as the organizational map for how government should be structured? And the appeal is certainly there because we have, and not for the first time, a businessman in the White House, in the presidency. And I think there is a broad belief among voters, among the populace, that business is one way to quote unquote fix government. But if we unpack this a little bit and return to this measuring stick idea or the organizational chart idea, when we really dig into the question of why the government uh, scale should be different than the business scale, we quite simply come to the answer in the Constitution. Market is not the way to measure or judge how well government is doing, but the Constitution is the way. Takeaways here. Number one, the Constitution is the measuring stick for government. Um, Markets, and especially value of efficiency, are an appropriate measuring stick for private for-profit business. But they're only part of the picture for how we understand whether government is succeeding. Public servants, or we sometimes call bureaucrats pejoratively, which shouldn't be a pejorative name anymore. Public servants have a mandate not to focus solely on efficiency. The Constitution demands that they sometimes actually be inefficient, that they champion other values like accountability and due process, which are in some cases quite expensive. The country spent, individual school districts, as part of this, spent vast amount of resources racially integrating schools. The court said that's okay to do that. It's inefficient maybe, but there's a bigger value at play here. So this illustrates that bureaucrats, if they're inefficient sometimes, we should ask, well, what other values then are they pursuing, and take a closer look at that instead of just saying, well, they're being inefficient. Because I think there's a really strong argument to be made that, well, yes, but the Constitution demands that they be inefficient sometimes. And so the big picture here, and if you're listening as a public servant, the big picture here is that as a public servant or as a bureaucrat, it's a noble calling to balance three sets of competing values, only one of which includes efficiency. So the next time somebody rails on government as wasteful, inefficient, bound in red tape, well, there may be a kernel of truth or something to some of that argument. I hope that you have a chance to step back and say, okay, what's really going on here? Is this an example where a public servant or a government institution is inefficient because of the Constitution, because they're pursuing other values, because they have open records, and or because they are making sure that they're not offending individual rights? Before we cast government and bureaucrats and bureaucracy as negative, wasteful institutions, let's think about what their measuring stick is. And only then can we have a better picture of what bureaucracy is, what bureaucrats do, and why it's not always a negative thing. But especially how, if we view only through the business lens, how we may have a distorted view of the noble calling that is public service.